Picture the scene. A bitter February morning in the year 1869. The air inside Westminster Abbey hangs heavy and still, disturbed only by the rhythmic clang of pickaxes striking stone and the labored breath of men straining in the cold. The ancient Gothic walls, soaked in centuries of silence, now echo with activity as torchlight flickers against their worn surfaces, throwing elongated shadows that dance like restless spirits across the vaulted ceiling. Amid this uneasy light, Dean Arthur Stanley stands at the edge of a newly exposed cavity beneath the marble floor, his gaze fixed not just on the void before him, but on the weight of centuries hidden within it. The atmosphere is thick, not only with dust disturbed from long-forgotten crevices, but with something more visceral. A sour, fetid scent, trapped in this darkness for over 200 years, rises slowly into the torchlight. The unmistakable breath of ancient death. Clutched in Stanley's hands are architectural blueprints and crumbling burial records, pages that ought to offer clarity, but instead contradict one another. Somewhere below him, lost in the catacombs of royal memory, lies the tomb of King James I. Or so he believes. But what Stanley is about to uncover is not merely a king's forgotten resting place. It is a doorway to a darker revelation, one that reaches far beyond the bones of James. The truth lurking beneath Westminster's stones is not the grandeur of monarchy, but the grotesque treatment of its dead. A history of secrets hidden in lead and silence, too disturbing to commemorate, too shameful to fully erase. Before we descend into this vault of royal sorrow and disturbed dignity, take a moment to reflect. If the unvarnished past speaks to something in you, if you feel the pull of forgotten truths and uneasy histories, then this journey is yours as well. Let us know, wherever you are in the world, where you're listening from. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that across distance and time, curiosity binds us, drawing us back through centuries to a silence that still echoes. To understand what Stanley truly found, however, we must turn the page further back, not to 1869, but to a cold March morning in the year 1603, behind the walls of Richmond Palace. There, in the failing light of a royal chamber, Elizabeth I, once the dazzling jewel of the English crown, lay crumpled and wordless on the floor. For 4 long days she remained there, unmoving, as her attendants hovered helplessly nearby, too afraid to lift her, too reverent to leave. Eventually, they coaxed her into bed, though it brought no comfort. The queen, who had stood unshaken against the Spanish Armada, who had outwitted foreign kings and danced with envoys until dawn, was now a ghost of herself, clinging desperately to consciousness, gripped by the terrible certainty that if she lay too long, she would never rise again. As her condition worsened, Elizabeth began standing for hours in her chamber, sometimes for 15 hours at a time, her body stiff with exhaustion, her mind haunted by something darker. Her ladies, sensing the end, covered the floor with cushions, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Imagine it, the most powerful woman in Europe, paralyzed by fear, too terrified to sleep, sustained only by a primal instinct that lying down was a death sentence. They knew what was coming. Whispers moved through the court like drafts beneath the door. Elizabeth Southwell, one of the Queen's closest attendants, would later write of visions and omens. She claimed the Queen was haunted by spectral images of her own decaying body. And then, one day, a playing card was found on the Queen's chair, its head pierced by a nail. No one knew how it got there. No one dared ask. But everyone understood the message. To a monarch who had ruled as God's chosen, whose virginity had been shaped into a symbol of divine authority. Such an object was more than a threat. It was blasphemy. By now, the gleaming mask of the Virgin Queen had begun to crumble. Most of her teeth had fallen out. Her once glorious red hair had thinned to wisps. She refused assistance. She would not bathe. Her skin, once powdered and radiant, now smelled of neglect. The courtiers who once elbowed one another for her attention now drew back in silence from her stench, from the blackened remains of the smile that had once lit a continent. When Elizabeth I finally died on March 24, 1603, it was not peace that followed, but confusion, discomfort, and secrecy. Her Lady of the Bedchamber refused to allow a post-mortem. Officially, it was to preserve the image of the Virgin Queen. But why the refusal? What was so dangerous that it couldn't be seen? Was this about symbolism, or was something far more disturbing concealed beneath the skin? A month later, on April 28th, the funeral procession passed through the streets of London with a solemn grandeur that broke the hearts of all who saw it. From Whitehall to Westminster Abbey, the Queen's coffin moved slowly, drawn by horses draped in black velvet. The casket itself was covered in deep purple cloth, and atop it rested a striking effigy. Elizabeth I, carved in wood, painted, robed in state, wearing her crown and clutching her scepter. The figure was so lifelike that those who glimpsed it gasped aloud. Some swore it was as if she breathed. At Westminster Abbey, the effigy remained atop her lead-lined coffin, a queen still in command. Even in death, she refused to be dethroned. The streets, the windows, even the rooftops were filled with mourners. Every vantage point was taken by those desperate to witness the passing of an era. And when the crowd saw the regal figure lying above the coffin, as though Elizabeth herself had returned to say farewell, a wave of grief rippled through the city. There were groans, weeping, and a collective sigh so deep that chroniclers would later write, they had never heard its like in living memory. But beneath the purple cloth and carved glory, beneath the scepter and crown, lay something far more human. A leaden box holding the decaying remains of a woman who had ruled with brilliance and fear, and who now lay motionless, beyond reach, beyond defense, beyond myth. And the story, disturbingly, was far from over. Elizabeth I was originally laid to rest in a manner befitting a sovereign. Her body, sealed in a lead-lined wooden coffin, was interred beneath the grand monument of her grandfather, King Henry VIII, within the hallowed interior of Westminster Abbey. For royalty, lead coffins were the norm. They were believed to preserve the dignity of the corpse, containing odor and slowing decay. But as history would soon show, even these heavy casings had their secrets, silent, corrosive, and disturbing. 3 years later, in 1606, a quiet but calculated decision changed the Queen's resting place forever. King James I, who had inherited Elizabeth's crown, ordered that her body be relocated to lie beside, or rather, above, that of her half-sister Mary. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. In life, Elizabeth and Mary had embodied opposing forces, Protestant and Catholic, stability and upheaval, queen and executioner. Mary had sent hundreds to the flames. Elizabeth had ordered the death of a Catholic queen. In every sense, they were enemies. And yet, in death, Elizabeth's coffin was physically placed atop Mary's, stacked like verdict over memory. Their new burial site, located in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel, lay beneath a gleaming white marble monument. Commissioned by James and executed by sculptor Maximilian Colt, with painting by John de Critz, It honored only one sister. The effigy was Elizabeth's alone, her reign etched in celebratory inscriptions. Mary, who had once worn the crown of England, was rendered invisible, consigned to the shadows, entombed beneath her more celebrated sibling, like a historical footnote. An inscription in Latin attempted to mask the tension. "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of the resurrection." But no words could obscure the physical truth. Elizabeth's massive lead coffin, several hundred pounds in weight, had been placed directly on top of Mary's, creating a solemn, layered tomb that would remain sealed and untouched for more than 2 centuries. By the 1860s, however, time had begun to erode even the Abbey's most sacred records. The exact location of King James I's tomb had slipped into uncertainty. Archival notes conflicted, burial charts contradicted one another, and no one could say with confidence where the monarch rested. Westminster Abbey, once the epicenter of England's royal rights, now housed a mystery. Dean Arthur Stanley, a man of equal parts scholarly discipline and quiet boldness, was granted special permission by Queen Victoria to resolve the confusion. His mission: to survey the burial vaults of the Abbey in full. What he would find would feel more like a scene from a Gothic novel than a royal investigation. Less historical survey, more haunted descent into regal decay. The work began in Henry VIII's chapel, deep beneath the stones. A tablet at the base of the structure bore a chilling message. This vault was opened by the Dean, February 11th, 1869. That particular date, whether by fate or design, marked exactly 3 years since the death of Elizabeth of York in childbirth. Whether this eerie symmetry was deliberate or coincidental, Stanley never revealed. When his workers finally breached the stone ceiling of the vault, containing the bodies of Elizabeth I and Mary, they were met with a scene of claustrophobic stillness. The chamber was narrow, sealed tight, and saturated with the untouched air of centuries. In the trembling glow of torchlight, 2 lead coffins appeared, stacked one above the other like something from a graveyard fable. The upper casket, belonging to Elizabeth I, was larger, more refined in detail, its shape echoing the silhouette of a human form. Beneath it lay Mary's simpler coffin, pressed under the burden of her sister's weight. Time had transformed both. The LED, exposed to centuries of air and moisture, had darkened into an oxidized green, a patina that gave the coffins an almost otherworldly sheen, as if they no longer belonged to this earth. During the original 19th century search for James's lost tomb, this vault had been partially opened, confirming the arrangement. Elizabeth above, Mary below. History, layered in metal. But it wasn't just the coffins that drew Stanley's attention. On the lid of Elizabeth I's sarcophagus, he found etchings, carefully carved into the LED. A Tudor rose, her initials, a date. These were not random scratches. They were deliberate marks, a final testimony of identity and sovereignty. Stanley recorded them with care, aware that they told the Queen's story in a language older than speech, one of lineage, power, and legacy. And then there was something else, something less reverent. Among the formal markings, crude graffiti had been scratched into the LED. The name John Ware, dated 1645. That year held grim significance. It was the year James I himself was buried in the vault. Who had left this mark? A careless workman? A thief? A curious clergyman with too much time? No one knows. but the presence of that name etched into royal metal shattered the illusion of security. The tomb had been opened. Someone had entered. And if one man dared leave his name behind, what else might he have taken? It's a disquieting thought. In an era when royal relics were traded, collected, even revered as having miraculous properties, a vault full of sovereign remains would have been an irresistible prize. The idea that these chambers, constructed to be impenetrable, had been casually accessed is a revelation that unsettles more than it clarifies. It exposes a truth that hovers just beneath the stonework of the abbey itself, that not even the dead are safe from the hands of the living. There was one detail Victorian chroniclers almost universally ignored, a detail that clashed too harshly with the reverence they hoped to preserve: the smell. Opening a vault that had been sealed for centuries isn't merely an act of architectural disturbance. It is a rupture in the barrier between the living and the dead. What escapes is not just dust or air, but the dense, putrid stench of centuries-old human decay, released like a trapped specter into the world above. Elizabeth Southwell, one of Elizabeth I's attendants, once claimed that the Queen's corpse, swollen with foul gases, had exploded within its lead coffin. Though Southwell's credibility was later questioned, her story is not as implausible as it may seem. Lead coffins, for all their intended dignity and protection, are in fact sealed pressure chambers. As a body decomposes, it produces an array of gases: methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, each one seeking a way to escape. In wooden coffins, these vapors slowly seep through the grain. But in LED, they are trapped, accumulating pressure until the coffin becomes a bomb of rot, waiting for a fault line. This gruesome possibility is supported by similar accounts from other royal tombs. When Edward IV's vault at Windsor was opened, his skeletal remains were found partially submerged in a black, viscous liquid, 3 inches deep, a toxic slurry believed to be the remnants of putrefied flesh mixed with the collapsed remains of his wooden coffin. Elizabeth I's coffin, made entirely of lead and built to sovereign dimensions, would have been staggeringly heavy. Today's royal lead-lined coffins can exceed 500 pounds, requiring 8 pallbearers to move. With its thick casing and ceremonial scale, Elizabeth's was surely comparable, and for over 260 years, that massive weight bore down upon the coffin of her sister Mary, compressing it, sealing the two women together in death in the most literal sense. The image that emerges is not one of glory, but of grotesque intimacy. Elizabeth's decaying remains pressing down on her sisters for centuries, creating a disturbing monument to dynastic rivalry, a royal double-decker of decomposition no ritual or monument could beautify. But this isn't just their story. It belongs to a broader and far darker tradition, the history of how Britain treated its dead monarchs. Death never really ended their political usefulness. Even in tombs, kings and queens were still manipulated, still displayed, still used. Their power outlasted their breath, and their bodies remained pawns in the games of those who followed. This phenomenon is nothing new. In 1163, King Edward the Confessor's coffin was opened, and his remains moved to a new shrine at Westminster Abbey by order of King Henry II. Inside, Edward was found astonishingly intact, his long white beard still flowing, his corpse clad in shimmering cloth of gold robes, a bishop's mitre atop his skull, and purple shoes still covering his feet. It was a medieval display of sanctity preserved through time, but it was also an act of bold disruption. Henry did not hesitate to extract treasures. Edward's pilgrim's ring was taken, and kept as a relic. His magnificent burial garments were repurposed into 3 ornate copes, ecclesiastical cloaks, for use in royal religious ceremonies. What would today be seen as desecration was then simply expected. Monarchs of the medieval and Renaissance worlds routinely disturbed the graves of their predecessors, not with remorse, but with entitlement. They moved, stripped, and sometimes looted royal corpses as part of a larger theater of legitimacy and power. In my research, I came across an especially unsettling case, that of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester. His tomb at the Abbey Church of St. Albans became a strange destination for women who believed the embalming fluid within had miraculous properties, particularly as a cure for wrinkles. Local sex workers began selling small thimbles of the liquid as beauty potions, while physicians took samples for dubious scientific exploration. When the embalming solution finally ran dry, the desecration continued. Visitors began harvesting parts of the Duke himself, clipping hair, pulling fingernails, even removing bone fragments, until little remained but scattered remains. It was a grotesque trade in sacred flesh. For centuries, royal body parts, teeth, locks of hair, bones, and embalming materials were commodified. Some believed in their curative properties. Others sought them as collector's trophies. The result was the same. Kings and queens, once unreachable in life, were stripped and consumed in death. And it didn't stop there. In 1784, churchwardens at St. Mary's in Bury St. Edmunds took it upon themselves to remove the altar monument of Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and former Queen of France. Though there was no compelling reason, they opened her coffin and found that her hair had astonishingly survived the centuries, 2 feet long and still shimmering golden. It was a discovery made not with reverence, but with the giddy curiosity of handling a relic rather than a person. Less than a century later, in 1871, the tomb of King Richard II was opened during routine restoration. His skeleton was almost completely intact, but this didn't protect him from violation. Relics from his burial, scraps of wood, shreds of fabric, and a piece of leather from one of his gloves, were quietly removed and, years later, discovered tucked away in a cigarette box in the basement of London's National Portrait Gallery. The box was dated August 31, 1871. It had sat unnoticed for decades, a container of royal remains treated no better than forgotten bric-a-brac. This, too, is the fate of sovereigns. Once silent in death, they become objects of curiosity, not figures of reverence, but spectacles for the living to dissect, display, and profit from. Perhaps the most haunting example is that of Queen Catherine of Valois. For centuries, her body remained exposed at Westminster Abbey, displayed in a wooden coffin, left open for tourists who paid the Abbey staff for a glimpse at royalty in decay. Her corpse, once the consort of a king, became an attraction, uncovered, unguarded, unmanaged. This was not a one-off mistake. It was a pattern, a deeply unsettling one. Monarchs, no matter how powerful in life, were not spared in death. Their bodies were opened, moved, looted, and handled. Their dignity was a temporary costume. What remained beneath, flesh, bone, odor, was always the same. For years, visitors to Westminster Abbey could pay a small fee to the staff for a grim privilege: the chance to view the exposed remains of Queen Catherine of Valois. Her body, left open to the elements in a wooden coffin, was shown again and again, her death transformed into profit. It was a practice as chilling as it was routine, proof that not even royal bones were safe from the spectacle of the living. Directly above the vault where Elizabeth I and her half-sister Mary were entombed, stacked one atop the other like discarded trunks in a forgotten storeroom, King James I had erected a monument meant to awe and reassure. It was not merely a tomb, it was propaganda cast in stone. The monument presented Elizabeth I at the height of her majesty, crowned, cloaked in robes of state, and holding her scepter as if she were still issuing commands from beyond the grave. But a colored illustration, dated between 1618 and 1620, reveals an even grander fiction. It shows Elizabeth adorned in a crimson robe trimmed with ermine, a blue orb in one hand, her face painted with lifelike flesh tones. 4 gilded lions stood at the corners of the effigy, guardians of her eternal reign. None of that color remains today. The paint is faded, the gold has worn away, and what's left is stone, smooth, cold, and silent. The monument was never meant to reflect reality. It was a marble lie, built to project what Elizabeth wanted the world to remember: majesty, beauty, and immortality. Yet beneath that majestic illusion lies a truth far harder to bear. In the cold, airless vault below, Elizabeth I, who once ruled with iron precision and unshakable pride, lay entombed in lead, her remains slowly giving way to the inevitable. Her coffin, weighty and distended, rested above Mary's like a cruel joke, history's final act of irony. Dean Stanley's published account of the vault's opening is restrained, shaped carefully for Victorian sensibilities. But in its silences, in the words not spoken, the truth seeps through. Stanley wrote that the upper coffin, larger and more clearly shaped to the contours of a human form, lay atop the other. That one detail is revealing. It suggests that Elizabeth's lead casket had been molded tightly around her corpse, preserving its shape even after the 2.5 centuries. And if that outline had remained intact, then so had the form within, an echo of the Queen's body, sealed in metal, distorted by time. Victorian propriety forbade graphic descriptions. If Stanley noted signs of rot, corrosion, or any grotesque consequence of decomposition, he likely did so in private. But the public was spared those details. To protect the myth, he held back the human reality. Yet Elizabeth's role as a symbol didn't end there. Centuries after her burial, she was still being reshaped, literally. In 1975, her effigy was altered once more. A gilded collar featuring the famous Three Brothers pendant was added, crafted by H. Hughes. The decision was not historical, but theatrical, another attempt to uphold the image of Elizabeth I as eternal monarch. Even in the modern age, her legacy required accessories. If one were to descend into that vault today, they would find the LED coffins still there, stacked as Stanley had seen them. But lead, though heavy, is soft. And time is never kind. 400 years of weight and silence have likely left their mark, the metal corroded, warped, or fractured. The Tudor rose, the initials, the date, still etched into the coffin's surface, would remain like signatures on a guest list no one wanted to join. And the name John Ware, carved into the LED in 1645, would still be visible. A crude and enduring reminder that even the most sacred spaces can be breached. What Elizabeth I's story reveals, more than royal ritual or national mourning, is that death levels all things. No LED is thick enough, no marble pure enough, no myth radiant enough to resist the truth. The queen who once ruled oceans and outmaneuvered popes met the same fate as every common soul: decomposition. Her flesh broke down. Her bones stiffened. Her grave settled. The virgin queen, who had defied marriage, who refused to share her throne or her name, was finally conquered by the one force no monarch can defy. Not Spain, not scandal, but time. In the end, her remains were pressed into an eternal embrace with the sister she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Elizabeth and Mary, once divided by faith, blood, and fire, now fused together in death. Stacked like shelves in a forgotten crypt, their final position is a grotesque mockery of unity. But the rot in this story is not limited to Elizabeth's decaying body. The deeper corruption lies in how power treated her memory. Her remains were never allowed peace. They were reinterpreted, moved, opened, decorated. They became relics, props, symbols, anything but what they were: the final remains of a woman who had once lived, breathed, and ruled. James I, in stacking the sisters, revealed a cold indifference to their humanity. The graffiti etched in 1645 showed that reverence could be erased with a single scratch. Stanley, in his Victorian Curiosity, revealed that even scholarship can cloak voyeurism in noble purpose. And now, we too participate. We retell Elizabeth's story, not as mourners, but as spectators. We marvel. We consume. We forget she was once a person, not a performance. Her life, her death, her body, all reduced to narrative, exhibition, and content. And still, she is not left alone. Elizabeth I is still not at peace. Centuries after her burial, we continue to circle her tomb, seeking stories, symbols, spectacle. Her grave has become a stage, her silence a script. The queen who defied dynastic expectation, who resisted suitors and reigned alone, has ended not in sovereign solitude, but in a darker confinement than marriage ever could have imposed. Not bound to Philip of Spain, not executed like her mother, Anne Boleyn, but enclosed in a narrow LED box, locked inside a stone vault, pressed tightly against the sister she once feared and despised. Silent, unmoving, sealed away for eternity. This was the woman who once stood before her troops at Tilbury and declared, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Yet no heart, no matter how fearless, and no kingly resolve can outlast the march of time. Decay has no need for politics, and death makes no distinction between legend and flesh. What Elizabeth could outwit in life, courtiers, conspirators, kingdoms, she could not outlast in death. Not the years, not the weight, not the choices of those who came after her. If you visit Westminster Abbey today, the grandeur may overwhelm you. Towering monuments, glowing stained glass, marble effigies that whisper of glory and permanence. But beneath those cold stones, another truth lies waiting. A truth not carved in Latin or gilded in gold, but written in rust, dust, and pressure. The truth of what really happens when power dies. The statue above may speak of majesty, but the LA'd coffin below tells a different story, of corrosion, stillness, and the inescapable end that comes for queens and peasants alike. The smell that once wafted from Elizabeth's tomb has long since faded into the earth. But something lingers still, not the odor of decay, but the moral stench of what we do with our dead, how we treat memory as commodity. how we mine the past for performance, even as the bones settle and the metal bends. That may be the real horror here, not the decomposition of one woman's body, but what her fate reveals about us, the living, who cannot bear to leave her untouched. Beneath the vaulted ceilings and reverent silence of the abbey, Elizabeth I still waits. Her Eled coffin, softened by time, continues to sag. Her body, once draped in velvet and adorned with jewels, now compresses into the formless remnants of human fragility. And below her, Mary's bones remain, bearing the weight of a sister's symbolism, pressed together by history's hand for more than 400 years. The Virgin Queen, who once refused to kneel to any man, now lies horizontal forever, defeated not by foreign powers or internal plots, but by time itself. In the end, her only conqueror was the earth. And if the LED could speak, if the stone dared to whisper, what might it tell us? Of nights when the abbey creaks not just with wind, but with memory. Of moments when the chill of centuries settles in the marrow of the floor. Of truths too quiet to echo through the nave, but too enduring to disappear. That beneath the crowns and ceremony, beneath the pageantry and illusion, we are all only flesh and bone. Dust on the edge of silence, waiting.